Okay, sorry, caught me in the middle of drinking a glass of tea. I wanted to do one last lecture. This would be the last lecture for the third quarter. Everyone stop cheering. And this is really going to tie in very specifically with Larson and kind of the rise of the totalitarian regimes and that kind of thing. But as I was getting ready to start this, my husband sent me this Twitter pic from History Pics, and it said that, you know, Hugo Boss was the designer for the Nazi uniforms and that this is the 1934 collection. And you can see here we've got, you know, the security service chief, an SS officer, an adjutant, guard officer, elite honor guard, mess waiter, protection squad, Reich leader, sentry. And my first thought was, really? Hugo Boss? And I actually kind of questioned it a little bit, so I did a little judicious Googling, and here we go. There's an article that says they did indeed find out that he did design Nazi uniforms. So I just thought that was kind of interesting, just to kind of tie it into things today. So yes, when there's a lot of German businesses, whether it's Hugo Boss, whether it's, you know, BMW, whether it's Volkswagen, that were tied to the Nazi regime. I don't know that that means we should boycott them. It doesn't mean that necessarily. As this article points out very clearly, you know, everybody kind of had to. You've read in Larson how, you know, if you wanted to protect your livelihood at all, you had no choice but to belong to the Nazi Party. So, you know, when it comes down to your life or somebody else's life, you're going to take care of your life and your kids. I mean, it's easy to talk about taking a green stand when, you know, you don't have kids. But when you have children and you have a livelihood, you're going to think twice about that kind of thing. So, but I just thought it'd be kind of interesting to give you some context for what we're talking about. And then my husband also showed me this one, which is a map of a Nazi propaganda map that showed, let's see if I can get it to zoom in appropriately enough, that showed their perception of Allied control of their colonial empires in 1916. So part of their justification, I guess you could say, for why they're doing what they're doing and why the Treaty of Versailles was so awful. And you can see the lion represents Great Britain and all the different little lions around here. The rooster represents France and all of its little holdings. And, of course, the polar bear is Russia, and then the buffalo, I think it is going to be America. And so very clearly they are justifying what they're doing. But I thought that was just kind of an interesting perspective. You know, nowhere in there do they mention the German Empire or Turkey or anything like that. Just to kind of give you the context for why the perception of the end of World War I was what it was. So, that being said, I will close out of my Twitter little information for the day. I just thought that was fascinating. Hugo Boss, really. Okay, so let's go to the 1930s. And I titled this The Making of World War II. Because in a lot of ways you have in the 1930s the construction of World War II. It doesn't happen just out of nowhere. It happens because you know, World War I was not ended well, and you don't see the 1920s or the 1930s doing anything to change that. So we're going to look at post-World War I conditions and then explain why the U.S. adopted a policy of isolationism. And this one right here, let's see, I don't wonder if I can get this thing to go down a little bit. There we go, that'll work. So I want to explain the difference between communism and fascism. This is an essential piece to understanding totalitarianism. Communism and fascism are diametrically opposed. You cannot be a communist fascist or a fascist communist. They are not the same thing. Communism, and you should be somewhat familiar with that from what we've talked about with Bolshevism and the concerns about unions. The idea is that you have two classes, right? You've got, pretty much everybody else, and then you're going to have like the party leadership. Or, if you're thinking in terms of American unions, union membership, and then everybody else, right? And so there's kind of a us against them mentality. Practically speaking, if you're talking about pure Karl Marx communism, you're talking about the owners of production versus the workers. But keep in mind that Karl Marx, that his version of communism is an ideal state. It's almost as though he doesn't expect it to ever really come into being. And he certainly doesn't think in the 1850s when he develops this idea that it can be forced, that it has to be something that society comes to on its own. Well, that's not how the Bolsheviks see it, right? They decide to force it. And so what you have essentially is the ruling class of the party and then everyone else. And the ruling class distributes all goods so that you see that, there's not really any private ownership. There's no private business, no private enterprise. You've got the state planning and controlling the economy, a single authoritarian party holding power. They decide how everything is distributed. In theory, everyone has the same. Now, in practice, if you're a higher up, if you're one of the big guys in the party, you're going to end up with a little bit more than everyone else because, well, you work so hard for the party and that kind of thing, and that your efforts for the party somehow outweigh the efforts of other people. Doesn't quite make sense, but I'm just saying that's how it is. The other part of this, too, is that in the case of the Soviet Union, Stalin is a single leader. Now, he has a party around him. He's got leaders in his party around him. Very clearly, he runs this as a dictatorship. Under Lenin, it was, back in the early 20s, it was a little bit different. You had Lenin, Trotsky, Stalin, and then Lenin and Stalin. And, so you kind of have this shifting. Initially, Vladimir Lenin did not intend for it to be a single leader. He intended for it to be a small group of 3 or 4 or 5 leaders. It just doesn't work out that way, in large part because Stalin takes over and then Lenin dies, and Stalin was going to be in charge, right? So Stalin kind of dictates how everything is distributed, how power is distributed, and because of that, he kind of controls who gets what. So in theory, right, it's about equality, but in practice, it's really not. It's about the same kind of totalitarian control. The difference is in how they view state control. In communism, it's all about the state, it's all about the party, and there is no private ownership. Vladimir Lenin, of course, is really kind of the founder of communism. You could also put Stalin in here for the Soviet Party. And a lot of communism focuses on control through what we call hegemony, this idea of influence. Think the United States and Cuba, right? And, the United States in, say, Mexico a little bit, around World War I, where very kind of Roosevelt corollary kind of stuff. Like, we're going to keep an eye on you, and if this region's unstable, we're going to swoop in and stabilize you. Well, that's how communism functions, right? Communism, in some cases, they actually have soldiers stationed in a particular place. In other cases, they don't. Sometimes they handpick leaders. Sometimes they don't. But by and large, they have a strong military. So there is an emphasis on militarism. But they use their militarism to basically say, do what we want, and we'll leave you alone. And then if you don't do what we want, then we'll send the troops in. So there's kind of this compliance that they get because they always have this big stick ready to pound people with. And as you know from American imperialism, that does tend to create some resentment. Now, the difference is the United States had a lot more angst about it. They worried about how it looked, and they tried to be fair, and let's have economic opportunity. Soviets do that at all. Now, in fascism, it's different. It's different and it's the same. You still have the concept of a strong national identity. Not so much, it's not built around a party, it's built around a strong single leader. Now, in the case of, Hitler, he is the single leader. In the case of, Italy, it's Mussolini. In Spain, it's Francisco Franco. So you have these strong leaders that control fascist regimes, but it's not so much about the party as it is about the dictatorship, and as it is about the national identity. We are Germany. We are Italy. We're strong. You can't beat us. We're tough, you know. And there's kind of a level of aggressiveness to what they do, where they focus a lot on taking over territory, on intimidating other people, and being kind of bossy like that. You also see that the nation is more important than the individual. Territory is crucial to the national identity. If we're going to have a big, strong football team, we've got to play some games, right? And so that's what you see happening with fascism. So they're constantly rattling their sabers to get more territory, and nothing will ever be enough in fascism. And so you have them, because the nation is more important than the individual, they typically, you know, and I think there was a quote in Larson's book where Hitler says something about the public weal is more important than the public will, is more important than anything, right? And that's certainly, that idea is there, and you kind of have that a little bit with communism, but in fascism it's a little bit different. And so you see that, you know, that the individual has to sacrifice everything for the country. Now, you're allowed to own private property, private goods, have your own business, as long as you're willing for the government to dictate what you do with that. So the government can show up to your factory and say, yeah, I think you're going to stop making pots and pans, and you're going to start making rifles. And you'll say, okay, yes, thank you very much. Because if you want to complain about that, then they'll basically, you know, destroy you. So that's kind of, there's a level of freedom, a level of encouraging prosperity by individuals. It just is not interpreted being for everybody. And so it's very anti-communist. Fascism is extremely anti-communist. So you want to be sure and have that in mind whenever you talk about fascism and communism. Okay, so now that you have kind of a fundamental understanding of communism and fascism, let me remind you of the incredible damage that Europe was in. You know, you have, you know, 4.5 years of trench warfare. You have, you know, the beginnings of, you know, shelling on cities and communities, the effects of poison gas. You have, you know, a whole generation of young men that have been wiped out or severely damaged. This is the first war where we see PTSD. Back then it was known as shell shock. You know, because of the horrible fighting conditions and that kind of thing. So yeah, so World War I is a very different kind of war that, you know, really kind of changes Europe in a lot of ways. We have U.S. banks that have loaned money to Europe, but Europe is having trouble paying them back. Germany was essentially dismantled. And dismantling the military, dismantling with the reparation payments, you're creating this situation where Germany never has any chance. I mean, they've taken away their richest industrial region. You know, it's, you know, it completely made it so that there was no hope for Germany ever. And they have all these veterans. They have this huge kind of history of pride, and there's nothing they can do about it, right? World economies are increasingly interconnected because thanks to imperialism and colonialism, they began to realize, you know, if we work with each other, you know, if I have markets for my goods, then that's going to help me be more profitable. And so they begin to kind of have a little awareness of this without even recognizing that they needed to cooperate with each other, which I think is a big difference. You know, nowadays, I think we do on some level recognize we need some type of cooperation. Even, you know, with the exception of, say, rogue states like North Korea. You have industrialization that had created a large middle class. This middle class had wealth. Maybe not wealth in terms of they never have to work again, but they had a savings account, they had a house. And the big problem with the issues, whether you're talking Germany or you're talking the Great Depression in the United States, regardless of the country, the big problem is going to be that that middle class sees their wealth disappear overnight. And that makes them very uncomfortable. Your working classes were always struggling. Your poor were always struggling. So the only social class that actually survives this whole period of depression with any kind of success is going to be the very wealthy. And as we've discussed before, that's a very small percentage of the population. You also had, beginning with Woodrow Wilson in World War I, the emerging idea of democracy as an ideology. That it's not just about the U.S. doing its own thing, right, or, you know, trying to look out for its own interests. Now, which is what it was in the Mexican-American War, for instance. And, you know, you begin to see with the Spanish-American War, and certainly with World War I, that the United States starts to become concerned with promoting democracy. And so this begins to become an idea that we can take someplace. This solidifies after World War II, and we'll see that a lot of the Cold War is connected to this concept of taking democracy all over the world. That's an idea we can give to people. And that's a real kind of intellectual leap. Prior to this, most people saw democracy as something a group of people had to want for themselves. So this is actually kind of a big transition. Why was Europe attracted to radical parties and not democracy? Lack of experience with democracy. Remember, many of these countries had monarchies for a long time. Many of them were new countries, Germany and Italy, for instance, relatively new, nationalized at the second half of the 19th century. And even then, when they nationalized, they consolidate a series of principalities into one king. And so you have this kind of, you know, even the ones that have constitutional monarchies, those are very inexperienced with democracy, so to speak. We're going to see that advanced industrialization had led to depersonalization of the individual, where, you know, everyone feels kind of like a cog in a wheel. You begin to have unionization, which means that people are willing to join organizations and groups, and they recognize that individuals in and of themselves are not going to be able to be successful, that maybe they need to work together with people. So you've got that. You're going to have more class divisions. You're going to have expectations of government thanks to, you know, the industrial period. We certainly see that in the United States. And keep in mind that the economic turmoil hits Europe in the mid-1920s, you know, before it hits the United States. And so this is part of why the U.S. in the late 20s, their insistence that somehow they were going to manage through this with this constant speculation and investment was pretty unrealistic. You have Vladimir Lenin, who essentially triggers the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia. And he, you know, he's the one that comes up with the idea that you can force communism. And it's under him that you see Bolshevism take over. Now, he'll die like in 1922 or 23, something like that. And Stalin will take over. Now, Stalin's version of communism is completely different. It is not the same thing. And what Leninism and what Stalinism have is nothing like Marxism. So understand that when we talk about communism, we are talking about a totalitarian system. We are talking about a system in which private ownership is discouraged. But it's discouraged by a party, and that party has a leadership that kind of controls things. So the Russian Revolution in 1917 establishes communism. You have to understand the pre-revolution conditions, the frustration with World War I, the fact that the Tsar's people, and even the new government under, what was his name? Starts with a K. I don't know. Anyways, oh gosh, it's right there on the tip of my tongue. Anyway, it starts with a K. Anyways, that both of them were trying to end the war, and the Bolsheviks were like, no, we're out of here. And so that, and you had a lot of people, you know, you had a pretty strong monarchy, you had a strong nobility that took advantage of serfs. I mean, you had serfdom legislated serfdom in the Soviet Union until like the 1870s. So even after the existence of slavery in the United States, and serfdom, while not being identical to slavery, it certainly has some components in that people who didn't have freedom of movement and that kind of thing. And so you've got a lot of conditions that make Bolshevism take hold, and make Leninism and Stalinism take hold. So you have this concept of the state, and the state controls everything. The state controls distribution of resources. They guarantee how much money you make, what kind of house you live in. Everybody lives very much the same. Very similar to what Huey Long had suggested, although, like I said before, Huey Long would have been appalled that you compared him to communism. And so it is, really the individual has a very minimum role to play. And so they are a one-party system with no opposition. In 1922, they become the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics because they create this thing called a Comintern, which is where they basically kind of influence and have this hegemony over smaller countries, encouraging them to communism. And so they do that, excuse me, in 1922, and they kind of become this affiliation, as opposed to being, in the USSR, it's not that it's all one country. I mean, it is in the sense that it's all one party. They all belong to the same party, so the party leadership in Russia is the one that calls the shots. But the reality is, in practice, or I guess, technically speaking, you have a union of socialist republics. Now, no one republic is going to do anything that Russia doesn't want you to do, thanks to the presence of their military. Joseph Stalin solidifies his control. Remember that the Soviet Union or Russia had had a civil war that goes on until like 1921. Then you have Vladimir Lenin in place, then he gets sick and dies, then you have Stalin wrestling for power. So by 1926, Stalin has pretty much control, and he has these 5-year plans of industrialization where he's going to take Russia and move it into the 20th century. And basically, they start taking over farms, and they collectivize everything, and they tell people what they're going to grow and when, and they make people go join factories. And they ignore the group of people, the small group of independent farmers, and basically, because of his collectivization, you have massive famine in the Soviet Union, and there's some intent. He does kind of choose there's some party control over the famine, I guess you could say. And then you just have the fact that Joseph Stalin would have anybody who disagreed with him was killed. Understand that Stalin kills more people than Hitler. Absolutely, absolutely. There's no question about that. But the difference with Stalin and, say, the Nazis is that Stalin is an equal opportunity killer. For him, it doesn't matter what your religion is, what your ethnicity is, what your social class is. You either support him or you don't. And if you don't support him, he's going to kill you. So in that sense, I don't know, I hesitate to say it's better, but there's also a randomness to what Stalin's doing. Or it's randomness with a sort of bizarre logic, which is, I know if I disagree with Stalin, if I do things intentionally to upset Stalin's government, they're going to come after me. And so in that sense, it's very easy for you to do something to not get in trouble. Compare that with the Nazis and their Aryan agenda, or their agenda to, to essentially, weed out the weakest elements of society. Well, if they're going to do that, there's nothing I can do if I'm Jewish. There's nothing I can do if I was born blind, right? I'm going to be one of those people that Hitler's going to target, and there's nothing I can do about it. It's just because I don't fit into his perception. It's like looking at people in the cafeteria and saying, well, that person's weird. I'm not going to talk to them. It's that kind of silly kind of leap to judgment without understanding who somebody is actually. And so just kind of understand that this is one difference, but that Stalin's a bad dude, and he's not somebody you wanted to go to dinner with. And keep this in mind when we start talking about the Soviet Union being an ally of the United States during World War II. Because understanding this will help us understand a lot about World War II. It will help us understand a lot about the Cold War. This is Mussolini in Italy. Yes, he is quite the dashing man. Had a very florid speaking style. He was really quite an interesting person. Okay, he's not an interesting person. He's a dramatic person. You have actually fascism takes over in Italy long before it takes over in Germany. Italy was the newest country. It had just been formed in 1870. Conditions after World War I were particularly bad. And remember, Italy, while they were technically a part of the Big Four, they did not really achieve the gains that they had wanted to achieve at the peace conference. And so this is going to lead to a great deal of resentment, resentment towards capitalism, and kind of an idea that, well, we can't trust, the king, we can't trust capitalism. And so Benito Mussolini will found the fascist party right after World War I. And he'll they become known as the Black Shirts. And he becomes all about, a strong national government led by a single leader with a heavy focus on the military. And kind of this embrace of, allowing private enterprise and private individuals to play a role in this strong national identity, as long as they do what the national identity says for them to do. And remember, that's a big part of what fascism is all about. And so, the fascists very quickly win. He becomes El Duce in 1922, so he becomes that strong single leader. In the first few years, you have Italy being happy with him. It'll be interesting that by the time you get to, halfway through the World War II, you're going to see that Italians are pretty fed up with him, and they're ready to move past Mussolini. In fact, they'll kind of overthrow him and put the king back in charge, and it'll take Hitler coming back in, rescuing Mussolini, and kind of creating an alternate government, kind of like they did in France with the Vichy government. Hitler, we know a lot about Hitler. Lots of pictures here about what he looks like. Show my son the picture. Okay. We have the Versailles Treaty, the reparation payments, which we've talked about quite a bit. Keep in mind the National Socialist German Workers' Party. I call that catfishing, right? They labeled themselves this really bizarre, obscure name to make everybody kind of join and come to the meetings, right? And then once they got you there, they would convince you that that they could give you a little, whatever it is you really wanted, they could provide it. We've talked already, and I'm not going to go into a lot of detail. Remember that the Nazis do try to take over in 1923 in Munich, and that's what gets Hitler arrested, where he writes his Mein Kampf. After prison, he will change his tactics and focus on, winning through politics. This is where the stormtroopers and ROM become a big deal because they start intimidating voters. They start attacking communists and making it difficult for people to vote for the communists. And you're going to see by 1932, the Nazi Party is the largest party in the Reichstag. So within 10 years, they go from essentially being a minor, non-influential, almost a joke party, into being the strongest party in the Reichstag. They're supported by many Germans of all classes for a variety of reasons. Whether, if you're a World War I vet, you like their idea of national pride. If you're, a worker or a middle-class person, you want the economic stability. And most people see what he's doing as an improvement over the 1920s, as an improvement over 1923. So keep that in mind, lest we judge the Germans too harshly. They're seeking stability. They want comfort and control. People will give up a lot of things for security. What's that famous quote by Benjamin Franklin? He will give up his liberty for security, will have neither security nor liberty. People give that up because they want the stability, and that's what the Nazi Party provides. You're going to have, we've talked about the stormtroopers and how that he uses them, and we'll see at the end kind of the Night of the Long Knives, where they kind of get rid of the stormtroopers, and you have kind of this new level to the Nazi organization, but we'll talk about that when we talk about Larson. So just kind of keep that in mind. This picture right here shows you Tojo. He was the head of the military, and I think the prime minister after like 1932, 34, something like that. You also had Emperor Hirohito. Now, Japan is a fascist country, but they're not quite the same as say, Italy and Germany, in that they're not truly fascist. They are militaristic. They are nationalistic, but they revere their emperor. Their emperor is kind of a religious influence for them. And so what you see is that they are, that they're going to, then turn around and kind of have this dual leadership going on between the two, between Tojo and Hirohito. I have pictures here on the other side, right, showing you kind of the effects of the Japanese invasion of China, which begins in the 1930s, 1936, I believe it is, and they start doing this, very expansion-oriented. So long before Hitler is invading Poland or annexing Austria, we see Japan doing those very same things, and nobody paid much attention, because, well, it's Asia, and why should we worry about it? So Japan had a heritage of military control and cultural superiority. This is where you have the samurai soldiers, right? They had a very strict kind of society that focused on obedience and kind of collaboration. And they, Japan always had limited resources. Remember that they had watched what had happened to China. And so they very clearly don't want to be in the same position that China is, with European powers coming in and taking advantage of them. And so they are trying to keep that from happening. So if you remember correctly, they had very strict controls until the U.S. showed up and kind of intimidated them. And then they started on a rapid industrialization process beginning in the 1850s. And very quickly, in like 70 years, are caught up with where the United States is. Now, the big difference is they don't have the natural resources. So you have that problem. And this is going to cause them to start trying to annex Korea, to start trying to take over some territory around China. And they will, in fact, invade Manchuria in northern China, because Japan's closer to northern China. And they will do that, as early as 1931. And so they will take that over. Then they will begin to march into Nanking, into the southern part of China, in 1937. And they will, so this is pure territorial acquisition. And we just don't say much because, well, it's China. And, China has always been kind of the girl that everyone took out, right? And so we're so accustomed to China being taken advantage of that we don't pay much attention to these incursions there. Now, when Nanking gets invaded and you have this actual problem, now there's more to the story here. You have kind of a false attack on a train that the Japanese say it was Chinese communists that were coming after them, and they need to invade China to protect Japan from the communists. So you have a little bit of that rhetoric like you saw with Hitler. And because, Japan is fascist, they don't like communism. And they want their own particular brand. I think this tells us a lot later on that, Chinese communism is going to be very different than, say, Soviet communism. The way governments function in Asia is different than the way they function in Europe. And so, consequently, you'll have this huge invasion in southern China where they kill thousands and thousands of people. They eventually stop after about 6 months. The killing slows down, largely because it was so demoralizing, and then it just was a waste of resources, right? You have, military officers who are having beheading contests, in the streets of China and Nanking, and, that means that they're worn out to do anything else. And so you have, people saying, okay, well, this isn't the best way for us to use resources. So they start to put a stop to that. But yeah, they had some serious competitions. They used to attack women. They would force them into what they call comfort houses. And they did this in China as well as, in Korea as well as China. They take these women and basically, tie them to beds and let the military come in and use them. And so these women were just forced into prostitution, essentially, except they weren't getting any money for it, right? They didn't even have an economic benefit. They were doing it to keep their family from being murdered. And so you have that kind of behavior. They slaughtered babies all the time. So yeah, Japan was pretty vicious. If you were to extrapolate the 6 months of the invasion of China into 4 years, they would have killed more people than the Germans. Now, of course, there again, like I was saying with Stalin, it's different because they don't do that, right? They do put an end to the killing, and they do kind of try to find a way to focus on other things. But you need to understand that this period of the 1930s, that the Holocaust, as horrible as it is for its systematic nature, does not happen in a vacuum. We've talked already how, you know, the Indian reservations and how the colonial experiments in Africa and Cuba, even in the Philippines, led to concentration camp systems. So we have that happening all over the world prior to World War II. You get to, you know, the period to the 1930s, and what you see is that, you know, Japan's doing the same thing. So this is not a good time to be a human being, really. There's a lot of death and destruction happening, and so you have kind of some political turmoil in the 1930s. They basically assassinate the one prime minister and replace him with Tojo to give the military control. So you do have kind of that fascist element of military control. And keep in mind that with Japan simmering in the background is this long-standing relationship with the U.S. Of competition, of you know, U.S. limiting immigration. And kind of the you know, U.S. presence in Asia, European presence in Asia, and kind of this concept of being, you know, we're not going to be China. And so that kind of propels a lot of Japanese behavior. If we seek to understand why they were invading territory, if we seek to understand why they bombed Pearl Harbor even. This picture is of Hitler and a guy by the name of Francisco Franco. Francisco Franco was in Spain. He was what we call the Phalangists, the fascists. Spain had been taken over. It had a coalition government. They had a parliament system where they divided power based on the number of votes people got. So you had socialists, communists, Republicans, and a handful of fascists in 1936. And basically, the fascists in Germany and Italy don't like this, so we start basically a Spanish Civil War in the 1930s. Between the Phalangists, who are supported by Italy and Germany, and particularly the socialist communists, who are being supported by the Soviet Union, with the Republicans trying to get everybody to just calm down. So basically this is a proxy war. This becomes a justification for some of the Allied, the Axis powers, the whole reason why Italy and Germany agreed to take sides together in the mid-1930s is because they're going to stand up to the communists in Spain. We'll see that when Japan joins, it's the same kind of notion, right? Japan's going to join to protect itself. It's got very close proximity to the Soviet Union, so they're going to try to protect themselves from the influence of Russia. And then you've got, you know, Spanish Civil War, that kind of stuff. So really, this is a proxy war that's happening. It's kind of the first volley that's going on. Think, you know, Harper's Ferry for the Civil War or something like that. The United States tries very hard to stay neutral. In fact, you know, you do have some Americans. I can't remember. There's a book, a story about a little dog, and the dad gets wounded fighting over the Spanish Civil War. You know, not a lot of Americans went over there, but you did have some that volunteered to go fight, who believed in democracy. So just kind of understand that this is the situation in Spain, and this is contributing to the overall tensions in the 1930s. So you'll have Germany and Italy agreeing to support one another. Japan will eventually join by 1940 to kind of protect themselves from the Soviet Union. Of course, a lot of this has to do with the fact that Hitler's planning to invade Russia. But we'll give you a little more of this timeline when we start on World War II. And of course, you have FDR in the United States. And FDR is trying to navigate this very difficult period, not only domestically because of, you know, economics, but also because of the foreign policy issues. And absolutely, FDR is a strong single leader in the American government. So, I mean, this is a period of strong leaders. You don't have, I mean, it really, the decade demands single strong leaders. So American neutrality, 1934, all debtor nations from World War I announced they could not repay their debts. You're going to have the Nye Committee formed in 1934. and it will basically blame the economic situation, the debts with foreign countries, and the reason we got involved in World War I. Because you have to realize by 1934, most people are pointing to World War I as this is where it all started, right? Because of World War I, our farmers got hurt. Because of World War I, we had all this massive growth in munitions. Because of World War I, we have all this debt going on, and so they blame that period, right? And so there becomes this instance of the Neutrality Act of 35, where they make it illegal to sell weapons to warring nations. This has to do in part with the Spanish Civil War. We're not going to get sucked into another conflict, right? By 1937, you have warring countries can purchase non-military supplies on a cash and carry basis. You can thank the Spanish Civil War, right? They realized that that Germany and Italy are funding the Spanish Civil War and the Soviet Union, and there starts to be a little concern. Well, maybe we should help too. You're also going to see that the invasion of China is going to propel some of this, and so this is all to prevent the involvement in another world war. And they have all this. You have all this unemployment happening. And so not only are we wanting to prevent being sucked in economically, but if we have, if we're concerned about the role immigrants played in World War I. Remember, we still have very strict immigration policies going on, and we don't want current immigrants to influence any decisions because there was a perception that maybe German influences or British influences convinced people to pick sides. So I think that, I think that it's very important to kind of realize that this is what America's trying to do. We're trying not to get sucked into the same scenario. We're also trying very hard, to take care of ourselves. And we've got a lot of economic problems, and we've been left holding the bag because nobody's paying us back. Roosevelt himself was not an isolationist. He believed in what we call internationalism. That trade brings peace and prosperity, that I'm a lot less likely to, as I think I might have shown you this clip. It was in Mr. Bett's video, that you're a lot less likely to punch your own customers, right? And so I think that this is kind of Roosevelt's answer. But he's not going to fight the isolationist battle just yet. He's more concerned about fixing the Depression and preserving his New Deal. That's what his big concern is. And so, he's going to focus on that rather than changing the minds of the isolationists. Now, we will see that by the time you get to 1938-39, certainly by the time you get to 1940, he is starting to challenge the isolationists. He is standing up to them and saying, whoa, wait a minute. But certainly in 36 and 37, he's not fighting with them. He knows Americans want neutrality, and of course 36 was an election year. In 1937, when Japan launches their full-on attack on China, FDR will declare arms sales to China okay because he says there's not officially a declared war. So we can help China because, there's not a declared war. So they're not going to violate our Neutrality Act. And so you begin to see FDR works in a lot of different ways to respond to global situations despite the American desire for neutrality. And he goes to a lot of trouble to do that. He does that whether you're talking about him doing the destroyers for bases deal, where once Great Britain has gotten involved after 1939 and they lose so many of their machinery and troops and such at Dunkirk, you'll see him trading old destroyers for military bases. Oh, stop it! That's my walkie. Sorry. And so you have him using the destroyers for bases deal as a way around the Neutrality Act. We'll have him doing the Lend-Lease Act, and going to a lot of trouble by the time you get to the Lend-Lease Act of, say, 1940, of convincing people that, we need to start getting prepared. And so there's this process by which he pulls the United States into preparedness, so that by the time you get to 40, you start having an actual Selective Service Act and that kind of thing. So just kind of keep all this in mind as we're talking about Larson, as we're looking at the situation. And this is part of the foreign policy aspect of the 1930s that you need to be aware of. So this will be the last lecture for the second quarter. We'll go from here to, we'll talk about World War II when we come back after the next quarter. And I think that's pretty much it. And we'll spend next week talking about Larson and trying to make sure that you have a good concept of that. So anyways, that's it. Only 45 minutes.